Good evening. I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now, where we bring you experts from the UW community to talk about timely and important topics. The relatively sudden exit of U.S. troops from Afghanistan has raised important questions for U.S. foreign policy and military strategy. Why did we enter Afghanistan 20 years ago, and did we achieve our objectives at a reasonable cost? Did we stay too long or not long enough? The exit seemed sudden and disorderly. Was there a better way to leave? What lies ahead for Afghanistan, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the relationship of the U.S. to the region and our allies and adversaries? Joining us tonight to discuss these issues are two experts with ties to our poli-sci department. Keir Lieber is a professor in the School of Foreign Service and Department of Government at Georgetown University and a UW Political Science alum. And Jon Pevehouse is the Vilas Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at UW-Madison. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Our first guest tonight is Jon Pevehouse, current chair of the Department of Political Science, and as noted, the Vilas Distinguished Professor of Political Science. His research interests lie in international relations, international political economy, American foreign policy, international organizations, and political methodology. His work examines the relationship between domestic and international politics. He is the co-author with Joshua Goldstein of International Relations, the leading textbook on the subject. Jon earned his PhD from Ohio State University, but we are glad to have him at Wisconsin. Jon, thanks for being here tonight, and I look forward to your thoughts on the U.S. and the situation in Afghanistan.
Thanks so much for that generous introduction, Mike. It's great to be here. Great to be in Madison. So I want to keep my comments brief, and so we can hear from Professor Lieber and also from you all in the audience. If there's a tagline to my comments tonight, it is that Afghanistan as a conflict, as an intervention, was something that I've begun to label a necessary failure. As we all were reminded of this past weekend, the September 11th attacks on the United States brought tremendous fear, uncertainty, and a sense that the world was changing around the United States and around the United States foreign policy. Of course, the response to September 11th was, about a month later, the invasion of Afghanistan and the attempt to root out al-Qaeda and their Taliban protectors from that country. This set us on the path that we ended just this past week with the formal U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan 20 years later. Interestingly, what I want us to think about is a little bit how and why I call it the necessary failure is because, as I pointed out to audiences this last couple of weeks, despite the fact that we now have a lot of reasons why we think Afghanistan perhaps didn't turn out the way we wanted it, the way we were unable to state build there, and I want to talk about that in a minute. On September 12th, on September 25th, on October 1st, 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, no one was making these arguments. You know, there was an overwhelming sense that the U.S. needed to do something in response to these attacks, whether that motivation was revenge, whether that motivation was prevention of future attacks, whether that motivation was deterrence of attacks by other groups on the United States and our interests. So in that regard, the intervention into the intervention into Afghanistan after 9/11 was very uncontroversial in that sense. And of course, it became controversial over time as we stayed and stayed and stayed. But I think whether Afghanistan ultimately is judged a success or failure, we need to remember the context under which it started. To me, one of the interesting questions is the path that we took once we went into Afghanistan. Was this going to be a quick in or out? Was this going to be us essentially using many of our special forces to create allies against the Taliban, to find al-Qaeda operatives, to unseat the Taliban in hopes that a new government would come in and distance itself from al-Qaeda and its protectors? Or was the strategy to go in a more long-term sense and try to remake Afghanistan, maybe in an American image as a successful liberal democracy, or just as a more stable governmental system where we could make sure that terrorist groups would not use that as a launching platform for attacks in the Middle East, Central Asia, or even into the Western Hemisphere. So ultimately, the Bush administration makes a decision that state building is the answer. right? That the real way to solve some of this long-term problem in this region is to do what the Soviets had failed to do in the 1980s, what the British had failed to do hundreds of years before, 200 years before, which is to create a stable governmental system in Afghanistan. And so the quick in and out was taken off the table. And I will say somewhat, I think in a moment of hubris, the Bush administration decided, we got in, we did this very quickly, we can remake Afghanistan just as quickly. Needless to say, reality set in. That was not the case. It's an important reminder that even as of 2000, mid to late 2002, there were very few American troops in Afghanistan, around 8,000, right? And a year into this operation, there were only 8,000, quote, boots on the ground. Of course, by 2010, that had elevated to 100,000 troops, right? And so you see the nature of the mission change. You saw the nature of the deployment change. And that is what folks remember about Afghanistan. It's not the 8,000 special forces necessarily. It's the 100,000, right, multi-year deployments of troops, multi-year deployments of companies on the ground. Why did this fail? Why did it not succeed? In part, many people, of course, politically want to blame, say, the Bush administration or maybe changes the Obama administration made to Afghanistan. But ultimately, I think this was, and again, why I call it the necessary failure, perhaps a necessary intervention, but ultimately an inevitable failure. You look at all of the literature, all of the past scholarship, all of the recent historical experiences on what leads countries to democratize, to become democracies, almost none of these factors are present in Afghanistan, right? Most democracies are born or grow out of a few circumstances. They're in a good, relatively stable neighborhood, or they're isolated, as the British and the Americans were when we began experimenting with our democratic system. Not true of Afghanistan. They're surrounded by hostile and also somewhat unstable neighbors like Pakistan, Russia, and Iran. Per capita income needs to be at fairly moderate to high levels, or at least there needs to be a sizable middle class in a country for democracy to succeed. Not so in Afghanistan. There needs to be a history of successful political institutions. Again, the Soviets were unable to even by brute force engineer successful political institutions in Afghanistan. The British were unable to do so. There was sort of no history of good governance in that country, no history of even a fairly functional bureaucracy to run day-to-day government operations in that country. Like, very difficult. Finally, one of the main factors folks look at are things like ethnic, religious heterogeneity, right? Was this a fairly homogenous country? Absolutely not. It was divided internally geographically, it was divided ethnically. And so every major factor that we believe contributes to democratization was not there, right? And so sort of the idea that we could build something successful, that we could build something strong in Afghanistan, I think potentially was an incredible uphill battle. The final point I would like to make is simply alliances, right? I think one of the other hopes as we began to become involved in Afghanistan and build this sort of war on terror infrastructure, that our allies would be incredibly helpful. In the aftermath of 9/11, the US was lionized by the world. NATO voted to essentially to activate itself, as this 9/11 attack was treated as an attack on all NATO members. But if you look over time in the country and in the conflict, NATO, Germany, and Great Britain in particular did contribute troops. They contributed lots of materiel. Other NATO members along the way contributed some. But this also fell apart fairly quickly in that conflict. And I think because of that, because of all these reasons, you ended up with an Afghanistan mission that kind of frittered on and eventually fell away. So looking at the geopolitical factors, looking at the democratization factors, I would just offer my initial comments to say this was an incredibly difficult mission, if not impossible, but it was also one that the United States took on very willingly without asking many of these hard questions from the beginning.
Well, thank you, Jon, and we'll take up some of the consequences of that in the Q&A for sure. Our next guest this evening is Keir Lieber, a professor in the School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's also the director of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown. His research and teaching interests include nuclear weapons, deterrence and strategy, technology and the causes of war, U.S. national security policy, and international relations theory. He's the author of 3 books. The most recent is The Myth of the Nuclear Revolution, Power Politics in the Atomic Age. Lieber earned his bachelor's degree in political science from UW-Madison and his PhD at the University of Chicago. And I understand that bachelor's degree from Madison is the tip of a very large iceberg of the Lieber family relationship with UW-Madison. So Keir, great to have you on our program this evening, and welcome home.
Thank you very much. Yes, the roots run deep and the sentiment is as warm as ever. I can't wait for the day I can travel back to Madison and get back on the terrace and Memorial Union and have a pitcher of beer to talk about these quite depressing issues. So maybe that wouldn't be the greatest idea. I guess what I want to say is, first of all, that it is, I think, clearly Afghanistan, the Afghanistan project was clearly an embarrassing failure. And I'm not going to mince words about this. I mean, again, emotions are raw 20 years after 9/11 and the recent withdrawal. But I think it's very important that we understand just what a disastrous engagement this was and start to think about the reasons why. And more importantly, start to think about the reasons how we might avoid another quagmire like this in the future. The only argument, I think, for claiming that this Afghanistan was anything but a debacle boils down to some argument that we are safer from terrorism today than we were on September 12th of 2001. But that presumes that we couldn't have achieved the same goal without squandering over $2 trillion, thousands of US lives, and tens of thousands of Afghan lives in Afghanistan to reach that goal. Unfortunately, the real tragedy here is that, and John may be right, his basic sentiment, that there was a certain inevitability to this in the wake of 9/11, the climate of the post 9/11 world, where there was just no question that we were going to go into Afghanistan if the Taliban didn't give us Al-Qaeda and their heads on a platter. But I would also say there's a more important inevitability, and that has to do with a broader point about the drivers of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, which I would argue has mainly been driven by a misplaced liberal hegemony. I would call it, as Lewis Hartz called it, an illiberal hegemony, where the United States has sought to try and remake parts of the world in our own image, which I think is a fool's errand. And I at the end of the day, I would call for a return to a more realistic foreign policy, and that's about the only good that I think can come of this. I'll be fairly brief because, as with John, I would certainly like to address questions and try to address any questions that come up. But let me defend the argument why did the U.S. fail in Afghanistan? I think there are two main reasons. Number one, it was an impossible mission, right? It was the ultimate fool's errand to go into Afghanistan, no matter how long we stayed, to try to turn Afghanistan into a Western-style liberal democracy, okay? We may have had initial plans to just rout the Taliban and find Al-Qaeda, but in fact, our quick success on that immediate goal led us to believe that we could do much more. Again, it fits in with a general approach to the liberal hegemony since the end of the Cold War, but the immediate, in many ways, tactical success of the early months of the Afghanistan war, in some ways, made it inevitable that we were going to try and reach for much more. We were the Bush and company were feeling their oats, and we were going to stick with that plan. Why is it mission impossible? I mean, we already know, we have evidence that foreign imposed regime change doesn't really work that well. It rarely works well anywhere. And it certainly doesn't work in societies with enormous poverty, huge rates of illiteracy, ethnically divided, tribally divided, conflict-ridden places like Afghanistan. In trying to achieve this goal of remaking Afghanistan in our image, we became the occupiers, and that just created resentment. A resentment that was exacerbated by military actions that killed civilians, simply inspired greater opposition to us. All kinds of policies that we pursued in this project that were ham-fisted and counterproductive. trying to train the Afghan military to fight like Americans fight basically meant that we were going to have to give them all kinds of money and weapons and training and advice. And there was no clear way to get out of there. And finally, spending billions of dollars to prop up a thoroughly corrupt government just made things much worse and undermined our legitimacy in this project and the weak government's legitimacy. The second reason why Afghanistan was a failure, the cause of that failure, was that U.S. policymakers and military leaders simply lied to the American population. Maybe the best you can say is they deceived themselves into thinking that this was going to work, despite all the evidence that was coming out that this was, again, a fool's errand. It's both Republicans and Democrats. I put most of the blame at the feet of the Bush administration. The Obama administration wanted to get out, but agreed to a surge, never really tackled the problem. Trump did nothing concrete to get us out of there. And of course, the media, which generally, I think is pretty good at reporting disasters in American foreign policy leadership, particularly under the last administration, was rarely challenged these kind of upbeat appraisals that policymakers and the military were offering about progress in Afghanistan, about progress with the Afghan security force in general. And the thing that really gets me, and I'm just being honest in a more casual way here, is the utter lack of accountability. The same pundits and planners that predicted success in Afghanistan and urged us to spend blood and treasure pursuing this fool's errand have gone on to jobs in government and jobs at universities and at private sector think tanks. And they're writing op-eds saying why the Afghanistan withdrawal was a great failure, when really they should be blaming themselves for their role in promoting this failure. Just to wrap up, I'll say two things. One is just about the Afghanistan withdrawal. I'm sensitive to the plight of those Afghan citizens who cooperated with U.S. forces as translators and every other kind of role. We at Georgetown, and I presume at Wisconsin, have tried to find homes for scholars at risk and even students at risk. But blaming Biden for this collapse and disorderly exit is just a red herring in my view, compared to the embarrassing but inevitable defeat of the mission itself. I don't see any way that delaying the day of reckoning and the withdrawal from Afghanistan would have made things better. So from a humanitarian point of view, I don't see why having more Afghans die in a civil conflict was going to make a difference. And moreover, I don't think there was any way to get out of this quagmire in a clean way. As soon as the Trump administration struck a deal to get out, the Biden administration bought a little bit more time. But if we had not gotten out, the Taliban would have ramped up military operations and attacks against us, and things really would have been messy at that point. The Afghan government was a total house of cards. And I just think it was a no-win situation. And moreover, getting out is going to make us more secure. It's going to make the United States better positioned to be able to address important challenges. And I'll leave it at that. Perhaps we can return to the credibility issue. The very final thing I'll say, Mike, is that if you believe that American foreign policy since 1990 has been kind of dominated by this desire to remake the world in our own image, the solution is to stop doing that. And I think we can stop doing that if we return to a more realistic foreign policy, a foreign policy that identifies clearly vital national interests and only calls for the expenditure of blood and treasure for those interests and not for other kinds of objectives, many of which are hopeless. Thank you.
On that note, now let me just make sure I think I understand that you would both say we did have to do something after 9/11 to, let's say, hold accountable those responsible and deal with state-sponsored terrorism. Is that true? Did we need to do something?
I think so, mostly from a public perspective. Again, one of the things I study is how executives and leaders sort of respond to public impetus for policies. And I think in the aftermath of September 11th, to say, well, we're just going to gather some intelligence. I think no city administration would have survived that. Now, what form did it take? Don't know, but I think after those attacks, I think something was inevitable.
Yeah, I agree that the politics perhaps made it impossible to have done anything differently. But our job as analysts and scholars is to try and think about some of these counterfactuals. And again, I fully supported the invasion of Afghanistan. And I'm not claiming that by November of 2001, I had decided that we had done, job done, time to leave. Although, many of us were in favor of getting out far earlier than we did. I'll just say that, when you look at clearly the Taliban made a mistake by not delivering Al-Qaeda to us. And we achieved a remarkably quick victory, but it was based on, lots of cash and buying off groups that were, allied with the Taliban. And it's no surprise that basically this is the same strategy the Taliban took to take back over this year that we did in 2001. And I just wondered to myself, if emotions had cooled a little quicker and calmer heads had prevailed, might there have been a way to convince the Taliban to do what was in their best interest, short of a full-fledged invasion? I also think that the credibility argument drew us into Afghanistan. Somehow the Bush administration decided if we didn't, invade a country and do something as dramatic as this, somehow we'd get more 9/11s. The key to the whole argument, I think, in the end is if you believe that 9/11, that Al-Qaeda just got lucky, and I think they really did get incredibly lucky, a number of events that conspired to make 9/11 possible. I would argue that, the terrorist threat on 9/11 was not as great as it, as many of us assume. Again, I realize what a ridiculous argument that is prima facie in the face of the towers and the Pentagon being attacked. But you can't help but wonder, did we maybe overreact here?
And, why is it then, this, of course, morphed into a state building endeavor. And it seems like you both agree that that is a fool's errand. And if you just look up, a timeline of governance in Afghanistan, it's pretty clear what a tall order it would be to establish stability. But we did spend a lot of money there. Could we not have kind of won over more people? I mean, $2 trillion with 40 million people in an impoverished country. You'd think we could have done something more. What keeps us from winning people over into a different way of operating or relating to the rest of the world?
John, can I take this one first?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, this is a case of where, less is more. What do we need? Another 20 years, another $2 trillion? It's not an issue of resources. It's the basic strategy. And when you invade a country and try and impose a system in that country that nobody has any, institutional history with or even desire for, you're going to be in trouble. There was maybe a moment in late 2001 when the Taliban basically sued for peace. And if we had said, wait a minute, the only kind of society we're going to leave, only kind of government we're going to leave is going to be a government of competing tribes and ethnicities. And let's maybe find a way to share power and get out. That might have been doable. That's much less than what we tried to do. The problem, of course, is that the Bush administration came up with this brilliant concept. Look how good we were in Afghanistan. Hey, we can do this against Iraq. And the Bush doctrine led us down the path into Iraq, where we thought military victory was going to be quick and that we would pursue the same nation building project. Again, we were just feeling our oats, and that's not the kind of environment where cooler heads are going to prevail and wonder whether less wouldn't be more.
John, anything to add?
No, I think that's right. I was going to bring up Iraq in that context too, but these institutions, if they're going to be successful, the domestic governance institutions, they take time. They take generations to oftentimes to get set up and to really gel and to consolidate. And the idea that we could do this quickly, and Mike, as you said, and as Keir said, sort of in this inhospitable atmosphere, it was a tall order.
So William Schmitz asks a question: is there a general consensus on what the citizens of Afghanistan want? And I suspect there is no consensus, but how would you characterize Afghanistan in terms of there must be different groups that want different things, and they've been unable to come together peacefully?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'll take this one. I mean, look, it goes back to, again, my point about this illiberal hegemony. I mean, liberalism, right? Integrated liberal studies, which, by the way, was my favorite classes at Wisconsin were in ILS. Is all about accepting the idea that individuals, that there is no general consensus on what is the good society, what, in Afghanistan or in the United States. So what liberalism tries to do is adopt an approach of tolerance and rights for people to, pursue life, liberty, and opportunity, right? But it's because we understand that they can't agree on something. So the goal is to have a society where people have rights that allow them to live as much as possible, the good life as they see fit, and rights and tolerance are key. And, the United States and its foreign policy has not demonstrated that same kind of tolerance for alternative definitions of the way to live society. Again, I'm not talking about we should have tolerance for, extreme Talibanism and the enslavement of women and all the rest. Clearly, that's not the objective. But the acceptance of divisions and differences, ideological differences, sectarian differences, religious differences, would lead anyone to understand that, there is no general consensus. And above all, we believe that the Afghan people should decide their own fate. What the people want is peace, and prosperity. And boy, there are very few places on earth where that's been, more scarce than in Afghanistan. It's a tragedy.
And it goes without saying that with those divisions, ethnic divisions, sectarian divisions correlate with all kinds of other divisions. If you talk to folks who've served in Afghanistan, they will say going from Helmand to other, to Kabul to other provinces, the Northwest provinces, it's like being in completely different countries, completely different worlds. And you're talking about this completely heterogeneous society, and it's hard to imagine how this fits together, how this could ever fit together, how you get those power sharing. And, we made that our problem, essentially. And now it's going to be up to the Taliban to try to figure out how to move forward, or some other set of groups to figure out how to share that power. But I agree with Keir. I mean, with the since, the 1970s, the Afghanistans have been in a state of either civil war, internationalized civil war, some form of conflict. And so they want peace and they want a chance for prosperity.
So why hasn't it splintered into some natural factions that could function more effectively?
Like territorial division?
Sure.
You're thinking? Possibly. I mean, the issue with territorial divisions, those often also don't solve the problems. I mean, this was the debate over Iraq, right? Do you split Iraq into a Sunni, Shia, and Kurd state? And as people pointed out there, and you could point out in Afghanistan, first of all, you've got to have resources. It doesn't solve the underlying resource problem. Afghanistan is not a wealthy country to begin with, and you're going to have portions of the country, if it's divided up the way it, quote, should be, that would be potentially economically not self-sufficient. It would be utterly dependent on either international aid or other countries around them to sort of keep them going. I think that's a really significant concern. And then just because you got a border there doesn't mean you can't throw bombs across it, right? And make attacks across it. And so that was another concern with the Iraq partition plan was, the Sunnis and the Shia don't like each other there. They're not getting along. Just you put a fence between them, that's not going to solve the problem.
And I would just add that, I mean, I think it's wrong to imagine that Afghanistan has ever been anything but completely divided by tribe and tribal, sectarian, and other divisions, including territorially, and with the assistance of neighboring countries like Pakistan, it's never been anything but kind of a deeply divided society with, at different times, different governments in control in Kabul, but either way, de facto control of the country has always been contested.
Yeah, which
and
is
in
why.
a way, I would say quickly to follow up on that, what you said about Pakistan. I mean, in some sense, they're strong actors in that region who have an incentive to keep them unstable. I mean, Afghanistan, it was created as a buffer state to begin with, right? To make sure that Russia couldn't get to India and the British colonies. And so it was sort of made to fail in a way, right? Is one way to think about it. And Pakistan, Iran, and Russia have continued to keep that up to make sure that it continues to fail.
I'm amazed it has survived as, an entity that we still consider one place. But question from Kim Beatty: women have or had major roles in business, banks, and medicine in Afghanistan. How do you see this changing and very possibly shifting the religious and political landscape of the country?
Well, I think, unfortunately, this is going to be one of the bad side effects of this, right? Is I think all in early indications that the Taliban are going to return to some of their policies. Whether they are quite as repressive or quite as bad, I think remains to be seen. But I think the issue of women's rights in that country, and whether it's economic rights, political rights, I think is now something that folks have to worry about. Ultimately, what can be done about this? Again, it's not clear. And this, to Keir's point, this is part of how much is this about, local control? How much of this is about international norms and desires to promote human rights on the part of the United States government? And I mean, this is a difficult foreign policy choice, right? Where do you draw that line? I think the realists and the people who call for national interest draw that line very strongly, and they say this is not our business. Right. And I think others, interestingly, the neocons within the Republican Party in the 2000s, but also often Democrats, say, no, we should be involved in these types of decisions and using some of our policy levers to pull that and to improve women's rights in Afghanistan, for example.
Keir, how far would you go in Afghanistan to improve women's rights, or what actions would necessitate, in your opinion, the need for military intervention? What sort of behaviors?
I'm sorry to say, I don't see any scenario in which I would advocate military intervention into Afghanistan to preserve women's rights. It's, again, another tragedy. Look, it could be that the Taliban statements about not, seeking revenge on those in society that you normally would think they would, and allowing some rights within a certain religious spectrum should be taken as a real indication of a change of mindset. I mean, I wouldn't bet on it. Of course, I hope for it. I mean, I think that the Taliban, if they realize what gender diversity and leadership roles in important professions, the positive impact that would have on their society, that would be terrific. I just don't see it happening. And I certainly don't see any reason, I think an intervention of that nature would just set back any kind of a progress on that front that we might imagine.
Question from Catherine: does the exit of U.S. troops from Afghanistan show weakness in democracy or weakness in the United States? And what's the perception of the U.S. exit internationally right now?
Yeah, if John, if I can, I want to get on this. No, the credibility, the argument that U.S. credibility is in tatters because of our exit from Afghanistan is just wrong. I mean, first of all, there's nothing more than Russia and China would like than the U.S. to stay in Afghanistan and continue to squander blood and treasure, which we otherwise might devote to confronting, real great power threats, particularly from China. We ended an unwinnable war, right? And that's the what that does for our reputation is shows that we're not willing to fight for something that's not a vital interest, and that we're able to recognize when our actions are being counterproductive. What happened with Vietnam? When we ended that war, it didn't lead to dominoes falling all over the world, right? NATO didn't collapse. Our Asian allies didn't question our motives and credibility in the Cold War anymore. And again, you can make the exact opposite argument that this bolsters the perception of the wisdom of U.S. democracy and foreign policy, but also just bolsters us in terms of resources, freeing up time and energy and resources for bigger, more important tasks. Again, like balancing China. And then there's one final part, which is that, for those allies, which I won't get into, who maybe were looking to Uncle Sam to shoulder the burden, in an area in which they might have had some interest, but had no desire to squander their own blood and treasure. Maybe this will, actually lead to a little bit more equitable sharing of the burden when it comes to common foreign policy tasks. Again, I doubt it. Uncle Sam's going to keep doing dumb things all over the world, probably. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that. But it certainly is not undermining our credibility that we won't protect our vital national interests in other areas of the world.
John, do you agree?
I agree. And I would just quickly add to that, one of the narratives that came out last week in particular was, well, two, right? One was, as Keir alluded to, what's China going to think? Well, what China should be worried about is that we can now repurpose all these resources to thinking about what we're going to do with the islands that they're expanding in the South China Sea. I think the second thing, the second narrative you saw was about NATO, right? Oh, NATO, we've lost credibility with NATO. Right? The German foreign minister was very critical of the U.S. withdrawal. Germany contributed a good amount to the mission, the NATO mission in Afghanistan. As anyone will tell you, the moniker, the technical name of the forces in Afghanistan were the ISAF, the International Security Assistance for International Security Assistance Forces. Any American troop began referring to that as "I saw Americans fight" during the Afghanistan war, because the Europeans weren't helping that much. And so now for the Europeans to come up and say, "You didn't do enough. Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell us more ahead of time?" To me, it's a little rich. Given that they really wanted us to be in there and do the bulk of the fighting and pay the bulk of the bills. And so I agree with Keir on this one. I think the credibility argument isn't that strong.
Yeah, Mike, can I just add something about NATO and yeah, some of the comments coming out of Europe about, criticizing this withdrawal. I wonder what's going on there. I don't really know the answer, but I suspect a lot of it has to do with, whistling in the dark about fears about what is the glue that really holds NATO together anymore. Again, I tell my NATO friends that the United States is going to be pivoting and looking at China. And, for all the talk about Russia, the scenario of them invading the Baltics to protect Russian people and the U.S. and NATO getting in a shooting war with Russia, there's not zero danger of that happening, but the NATO alliance was a military alliance created to confront the Soviet Union in the Cold War. No Soviet Union, no major military threat. What does that leave? Well, we got to talk about the alliance as some kind of liberal project where like-minded people, we can transform societies. Maybe Hungary won't, keep going down that path, or Poland, and return to the Jeffersonian democracies that we want through this alliance. And as you can already tell, I don't really buy that argument. I think NATO's in trouble. And I think some of the criticism here is, oh gosh, I hope the US doesn't start simply advocating for its vital national interest, because it's going to be hard for the United States, US leaders to justify huge expenditures and commitment to NATO if it actually had to do anything of significance.
So the capital, or the president of the United States lives in the White House, and the United States should be engaged in Afghanistan. Those might be the only two things that Bush, Obama, and Trump apparently agreed on, right? It'd be hard to find policies that they all continued and believed in and carried out. But then Biden left. So can you explain that for me? Like, why now? Like, if, I mean, I'm hearing from you guys, this was a horrible idea for a long time, yet Obama stuck with something Bush started. Would have been very easy for him to turn and run. And then since Obama stuck with it, I mean, Trump overturned as much as he could of the Obama administration, but he didn't get to this. Make sense of that for me. And then why did Biden leave?
So I'll take a stab. I was interested to see what Keir thinks. I mean, first of all, as I think Keir intimated, and I would agree with, whenever the U.S. was going to leave Afghanistan, it was going to look like what we saw over the last 2 weeks. No president wants that on their watch, right? I mean, you've already seen the narratives that have developed around this for Biden. And, is this going to lead to the red wave? Is this undermining confidence? Blah, blah, blah. No one wanted that. Personally, I think Biden knows he's going to be a one-term president. So he's not running. What does he care? He presumably wants to protect his party. But I think ultimately he just decided to pull the Band-Aid off. And I think ultimately a lot of military leaders were finally saying, like, it's time, we've got to do this. And he was willing to do it. And so for me, what I've been asking and trying to figure out, I don't have a good answer yet, was what was he hearing from, say, for example, inside the Pentagon? Because I agree with Keir, like, for all these years, I think the Pentagon was very much into the Afghanistan mission. They knew it was tough. They knew it was an uphill battle, but that they were going to try to pull this off. My sense is something within set of defense thinking changed, and that's would be one of my hypotheses as well. But those are kind of the two working hypotheses that I have. That everyone knew this was going to be a disaster, so they avoided it until Biden finally just decided it's time. And two, that there was some subtle shifting in the thinking within the DoD on this.
Maybe a China threat.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the story in the end is going to be told by great historians such as those at Wisconsin, who will get see the declassified documents and be able to tell a richer story. But my impression would be as follows: from the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003 through the end of the Bush term, Bush is just focused on Iraq, laser-like focus. Afghanistan kind of on the back burner. Things hadn't really deteriorated. 2009 is a big change. That's Obama. And Obama wanted out. But he was convinced. I mean, he was given pretty terrible options by his generals. They were sent back to the drawing board to give him more options. I think Biden was there for most of that and that's when he decided, no, this is a disaster. He's opposed to the surge, my understanding. But Obama, had a lot of other things on his plate. Again, priorities elsewhere. And how much political capital can you spend on that? Maybe he was convinced that a surge in Afghanistan would work, right? Bringing up numbers to eventually get out. I don't get it. Donald Trump. I mean, look, this is trying to find rationality in any of his policies, I think is foolish. The Mad King was going to do, pretty unpredictable things. It's clear he wanted out of Afghanistan, but he wanted out of everywhere and still didn't do anything other than agree to give Taliban everything they wanted for a commitment to walk away, which he never, of course, followed through on.
So Warren Nesbitt and Don O'Hearn have what I'll call related questions. Given the history of governance in Afghanistan, one could reasonably expect that the Taliban regime is not going to go on forever. Nobody has, right? And so Warren Nesbitt wonders who will take over when they fail, and Don O'Hearn's wondering when will a younger generation of Afghans emerge to start a movement over the frustration over lack of opportunities. What do you think of that? How long will the Taliban last? And who will succeed them?
That's a great question. I don't know that I could put a name to a group that will succeed them, but already you're seeing, I mean, within 3 days of the Taliban taking these provincial capitals, 2 were already back at war with splinter groups. right? I mean, and the Taliban was already being pressed in a couple of the provincial capitals, and their hold was being challenged already as the U.S. was leaving. And so it's still divided. I don't know how long the Taliban will be able to consolidate power. Look at a group like ISIS-K, right? You know, the new sort of ISIS group that's now sort of sprung up in Afghanistan. They were responsible for this terrorist attack as the U.S. troops were leaving. They're very anti-Taliban. It's clear they've got their hands on some weapons. Many of them probably brought in from Syria. They're gonna wreak some havoc on Taliban forces as well. And so the conflict isn't over by any stretch. I think these questions are right on. And when people talk about, well, is the Taliban really going to keep up with its promise to not harbor terrorists, et cetera? This all presumes that the Taliban is going to maintain some type of modicum of control, and it's not clear to me they are. And so I think the sort of scary scenario down the road is if probably not an attack on the United States, but if ISIS sort of begins to reform and spread again in Afghanistan, what then? You're going to see calls in the United States to either go back in somehow or to get re-involved. I personally wouldn't be very supportive of those calls, but you will certainly see them. And so I think I can't name you the group that will come up, but I do think there will be a number that compete for power. We saw this pre-Taliban. We're going to see it post-Taliban. And so, and this is the other thing about these deals that the Trump administration struck. Again, it presumes a level of governance there that it's a big assumption. Let's put it that way.
Keir, if you're running the book in Las Vegas, what's the over/under on Taliban?
I was going to say, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be a rich man. I'm clearly not. And also, I'll just say something that you don't hear professors say too often, which is, I don't know. I don't know the answer. How long the Taliban? I mean, I agree with everything John said, but just imagine trying. I mean, the idea that somehow the Taliban takeover is going to be a strong, stable government without divisions already is not correct. I think a lot of the change in tone of the Taliban leadership about post-conflict reconciliation, such as it is driven by their fear that and recognition that they certainly have not consolidated power in a way that maybe some in the United States think that the Taliban have. But the only thing I know for sure is that the U.S. ability to judge what's happening in Afghanistan, how things will change, is pretty paltry. Our record of success in figuring out what are the major fault lines and groups is not very encouraging. Again, this is probably where they should listen to some scholars and area experts. But the notion that there's just something to figure out and then we've got an answer about how to proceed, I think is foolish.
Before we get back to U.S. foreign policy, which I want to come to at the end and hear your thoughts, Eric Johnson wonders, did we actually leave behind billions of dollars of military equipment? And, I suppose the other question is, why? Like, couldn't we have started getting some of that out on C-17s, or could we blow it up rather than leave it behind?
Yeah, well, we did disable some of the most sophisticated equipment that he left. But I guess instead of answering that, I mean, where's the outrage about the money, the billions of dollars that we spent on the Afghanistan military forces? Forget about what we left. What about what we squandered, in the entire time we were there? How about all the money that we funneled into their, corrupt military officials and advisors' pockets? What about the $2 trillion? I mean, forget about some Black Hawk helicopters and a couple of Humvees, and I'm being facetious, is more than that. But, this is whatever equipment we left isn't going to measurably bolster the Taliban's power at the time. We should be focusing much more on what we've wasted and squandered while we were there.
You agree, John?
Yeah, nothing to add there. I mean, yes. I mean, is this something, back to something earlier Keir said, like what would some folks were kind of asking about this as well, I think implicit in their question, what would a better withdrawal have looked like? I mean, that's also, again, I think hard to imagine. Like, you're going to have to re-enter Afghanistan, go back in potentially with sizable military forces to get the equipment, get them out. They're then subject to attack. Is that something the American public or Congress is going to be happy about when when you have a growing number of casualties, that looks also sort of equally foolish. Well, we're going back in to get back out. And especially if you have a large scale number of casualties because of that, like I don't see that being any more politically popular or less controversial.
Todd Sherman wonders, how do we keep from repeating this mistake? And Charles Weiss asks, what should U.S. foreign policy be? And I guess I would see those as related questions. I was wondering if you could kind of summarize your respective thoughts on how the U.S. should approach foreign policy. And Keir, maybe you can give us the Chicago realist view of that.
Well, yeah, I will. Although, again, I'll probably pivot more to the more general point. I mean, so, if we're talking about what should U.S. foreign policy be, I'm a realist. I think we should probably be more of an offshore balancer. We should only, go abroad to confront, real potential challengers, regional hegemons like China. But in general, the use of force is fraught with unintended consequences. We should be spending much more on diplomacy and aid than we do on military force in other parts of the world, out of Asia. But it's interesting. The question is, the sifting and winnowing of ideas. There, I'm drawing on Wisconsin concepts here. That was the real problem, but in the run up to the Iraq War and arguably in the run up to the Afghanistan War, although not a whole lot of time, the marketplace of ideas in the United States failed. That's the failure of the media. It was the failure of scholars. It was the failure of policymakers to debate, objective realities and what exactly what was in our interest, how exactly this strategy was going to accomplish those goals. And a failure to reckon with obvious evidence of failure that just keeps coming and coming and coming. Again, if you watch the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary, it's like deja vu all over again when it came to Iraq and Afghanistan. And you ask, most of the folks that had to do tours of those in those conflicts, the notion that somehow we knew Afghan society and Iraqi society enough to tell them how to live their lives is just preposterous. So we need a liberal arts education which trains future citizens to engage and debate major issues of American foreign policy. And we've had some pretty massive failures to do that in recent years.
Yeah, I would just, as someone who's teaching an American foreign policy class right now, I would concur with that. I would also say, here's where I'll try to kind of divide, put a foot in both camps, sort of the realist camp, where I think Keir and I agree. I think China is where it's at right now. I think we were talking about this earlier, previously. I think 5-6 years ago, I would have said, look, China, we need to keep an eye on them, but they're probably okay. I don't think that anymore, and I've kind of become a more realist when it comes to American foreign policy towards China. I think Xi Jinping and his administration is going to become incredibly aggressive. I think they're unapologetically expansionistic. I think the real question, what as a researcher I've become interested in, is then what does the American public think of this? What does Congress think of this? Like, is this going to be sort of too late? A la, the 1930s and the rise of Germany. Is this going to be far too late to do anything about it, or sort of behind the 8 ball again? I could be completely wrong. Maybe China is playing a different game, but I don't think they are. And here's where I'll be sort of the non-realist answer. And here's where I think international institutions matter. I think this sort of post-World War II, what we call the liberal order built up by the United States, is incredibly important and was important. And in some ways, it helps us maximize our resources. I mean, this was one of the Trump administration's complaint. Why are we paying all of this to build, to have the World Bank and the IMF and NATO, et cetera? I think on one hand, yeah, we have to ask about the payment, but the flip side is what's the counterfactual? A world without those institutions, where the other answer is we're running around with the military, is a lot more expensive than paying our dues to UNESCO or to the UN. And so even though those institutions are imperfect, they fail sometimes. Every international effort fails sometimes. And so I think we have to keep our eye on the ball and say, where are the real threats coming from? And what are the levers that we can pull to do that? And I agree with Keir in the sense of, I think military force increasingly is potentially less important to do that unless there's a vital interest at stake.
So are you saying that the Chinese foreign policy, is that a realism policy as well?
I think it's yes, I think it's realist and I think it's mercantilist in its full form. I think they are this has been one of the criticisms over the years of the US. It's like, well, China wants to be a leader, but they're not paying enough to the UN. They're not paying enough to these institutions, et cetera. They don't see that as their interest. That's not their interest. They first want to expand in Asia and they want to get control. I think they want to gain control in this region. Their view of international leadership is very different than our view. I think it's a short-sighted view, in my opinion. And here's where I want to keep the foot a little bit out of the realist camp, because I think ultimately the Chinese may fail in this. But no, I think they have a very realpolitik view of the world.
Yeah, look, I mean, we can agree that domestically, the United States and China are dramatically different. Again, both capitalist societies, but ideology aside, we both want the same thing: control of the Western Pacific, right? And I think intense security competition. I'm gonna be very careful. Intense security competition and possibly conflict are inevitable between the United States and China moving forward. And it's because we cannot discern their intentions. We don't know what they want. They can say they just want peace, they want this, they want that, but we don't know. And great powers have never been able to discern each other's intentions. And secondly, military capabilities aren't necessarily going to keep the peace. Nuclear weapons are a great pacifier in international politics, but here's where I plug for my own book. They don't make security competition obsolete. They didn't make security competition obsolete between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. To the end of the Cold War, we're still competing pretty intensely, and they're not going to pacify relations between the United States and China. Again, I see real trouble coming, and therefore I think the most important thing for U.S. foreign policy is to confront that threat. And to be clear, I said, we spend too much on the military. It's more that we spend it in areas we don't need to be spending it on. I think we need to confront the rise of China, take it seriously, stop thinking that global institutions and the world economy and norms will bring China to behave any differently than any other rising great powers behaved in the past.
Do you think the governments in Central Asia and the Middle East view the U.S. or China as the bigger hegemon?
They don't like either one. How about that one?
Right. Yeah.
That they'll play it both ways. I mean, we've heard a lot about China's, Belt and Road Initiative and trying to make inroads. And I think there's a depressing story of China's influence in Afghanistan that still needs to be kind of told. But most of these powers are just trying to stay out of the fray and not get involved in a direct conflict. Our Asian allies in Japan and South Korea don't really have a choice. They can't continue to play. South Korea can't play. They're right next to China, huge economic interaction, et cetera. But, most of the South Koreans that I know are pretty clear on who they think is a bigger threat. And it's not the United States of America, it's China. And I would predict that those countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India, continue to move closer to the United States when it comes to an alliance to balance China, because China is the immediate threat in the region, and they're certainly throwing their weight around. And I don't think would hesitate to act on that soon.
Interestingly, I would just add quickly, I agree. They want to stay out of the middle. They want to try to leverage any competition for resources like we saw in the Cold War. Interesting, if you look at Africa, we talked a lot about China trying to make inroads in Africa. There's a pushback against this now, right? African states are becoming increasingly wary of China because they know China wants something from them now, and they're using this as leverage. And so this sort of the Belt and Road strategy of trying to force dependence on other states, I think eventually will be a losing strategy. And like Keir says, will drive folks into U.S. arms.
Which happens first? The Taliban government fails in Afghanistan, or China makes a play for Taiwan?
Oh, that's an easy one. Taliban falls.
I'm not a gambler.
Uh-oh.
Well, Keir, we'll have you out here and we'll discuss this further on the terrace. We are at the top of the hour, and I just want to thank you both for a great conversation tonight. Really very interesting subject, complicated subject, a very sad subject. Obviously, countless lives kind of destroyed by all that's gone on in Afghanistan, and we should all hope that things sort themselves out much better in the future. But a reading of history makes it hard to be really optimistic. Well, thank you both. And I hope to have you back again in the future, maybe on a happier subject. We'll try to find one.
Thanks very much. And thank you for the great questions. Terrific.
Yes.
What a great community. What a great place.
We've got a great audience. Great to have you back here. Thank you, John.
Appreciate it.
All right. That concludes our program this evening. We hope you'll tune in again next month when we come back with another episode of the UW Now. Thank you, and on Wisconsin.
You can try, but you'll never stop a badger. Because we badgers are born with curious minds and endless heart. When we see a curve in the road, we speed up. When there are mask shortages for first responders, we make our own supply chain. When there's a world on pause, we sharpen our claws. Through thunder, fire, and pandemics, we'll keep going. Because after all, you can't stop a badger.